Hi, and welcome to the very first issue of Rukus Reviews. Today I'm going to be reviewing Rise to Nobility. Rise to Nobility is a dice placement, resource management, engine building, set collection game where players collect resources to house settlers to gain victory points and nobility, and extra workers, which are used to gain money and more victory points, and nobility, which is used to impress the Stone Council to gain even more victory points, in an effort to, in the end of the game, be the player with the most points and become the leader of the Stone Council. Spoiler alert, I love this game. This is the second game in the Five Realms series from Final Frontier Games, following Cavern Tavern, which was my favorite Euro game for quite a while. So let's get into what I loved about this game, and of course a few things I feel could be improved. So the standard version of this game comes with some wooden blocks and some dice that are, well, pretty standard. But the deluxe version comes with these beautiful dice and some really cool custom resources. And what's really great is that the resources come in this awesome little tray that's completely removable from the box, so that you can have a much faster setup and takedown time. Unfortunately, the player board isn't quite set up to handle the size of the custom resources, so things can get pretty out of hand fairly quickly. Everything else is pretty par for the course, though there is definitely something up with these meeples. Artwork is, as usual, for the Miko. I'm not sure how to pronounce the name, but it's phenomenal. There are a lot of carryover characters from Cavern Tavern, which I really love, and I've seen comments from people who didn't care as much for his artwork style, but to me it's really great, and there's a bit of a whimsy to it. My only, I guess you could say, downside to the artwork is that with the popularity of this artist right now, there's a lot of games that he's worked on that it can be quite difficult to tell these games apart. It's not necessarily a bad thing, could be a good thing to some people, but it's just a thing. Now for what I consider to be the most important part of the game. There are definitely some things about this game that make it stand out from a lot of similar games. First off, the core of this game is dice placement. I've played a few dice placement games, but the thing about this game that really makes it stand out from the rest is the reputation track. Basically, the total value of all of the dice that you're allowed to play each round can't exceed the value of your reputation. So if your reputation isn't high enough, you might not get to play all your dice that round. Reputation can be increased through some workshop buildings, through one of the spaces for community buildings, and by spending a die in one of the locations on the board. This means that when your reputation is really low, you're really hoping to roll low numbers and having to choose whether or not you want to spend some of your already limited resources to increase that reputation. Spoiler, you should absolutely do that. And later in the game, when you're rushing to get as many victory points as you can, you really have to do a bit of a balancing act, because the Stone Council, where you get by far the best way to earn victory points, also loses you 2 reputation every single time that you use it. So you really have to be careful not to use it too much too early, and of course to try and not lose so many reputation points that at the end of the game you can only play a few of your dice if you happen to roll a few high numbers. Another major thing that I really love about this game is the overall game flow. I love that the necessary elements in the early game become almost useless by the end of the game. At the beginning, there's a heavy focus on trying to get as much money as you can and house as many settlers as you can, but at the end of the game, money isn't worth anything for the end game, and the settlers aren't the best way to gain victory points at the end. Over the 10 rounds of this game, I've personally found that your focus generally shifts about twice. It doesn't always happen in the same rounds at the same times, but It's kind of like a game in 3 acts. And I found that the harder I push at the beginning, the more difficult it can be to change directions whenever I need to. And if I wait too long to change directions, I'm left with a bunch of stuff that's not as useful to me anymore, and I have to try and figure out ways to get it to work for me. But if I change directions too early, then everything kind of slows down and it becomes a lot harder to build the engine. I even found once when I was playing that I tried to kind of skip over the beginning portion and go straight to the strategy that you handle through the middle, so that maybe I could get to that end strategy and get those Stone Council tiles earlier. And I could really tell by about the 3rd or 4th round that I was absolutely not going to win this game. I'd also suggest that you use the event cards, because while they don't make a huge shakeup to the game, they do have some interesting ways that they kind of change your focus from time to time, and from one game to the next, it gives a little bit of extra replayability. As a follow-up to Cavern Tavern, there are definitely some comparisons to be made. It is a dice placement game, as Cavern Tavern was, but for those who've played Cavern Tavern and haven't played Rise to Nobility, it is a very different game. For one thing, one of my least favorite aspects of Cavern Tavern was that I often felt lost. And this was heavily due to the fact that there's not really any engine building that goes on in that game. But in Rise to Nobility, you start out with a very clear focus, because until you've completed that very first settler, there's not really a lot of additional options. But once you do, which usually happens within the first round, the game opens up a little bit, but you've kind of got a path that you've started going down, and you really have kind of a heading of where to go next. I have a couple of times been at that point where I wasn't really sure what to do next, but usually that was because I didn't handle the engine building quite right. Another big gripe for me about Cavern Tavern was that there were a number of spaces on the board that I always felt were massively underutilized. There were some areas that were so difficult to use that it never really felt like it was worth it to even try to use them. And then there were some aspects of the game that I didn't feel like they gave a good enough benefit, or I just felt like they were almost never used. There are definitely places on that board that in the many times we've played the game have never been used in a game I've played. Rise to Nobility, on the other hand, every single game that I've played, I've used every location on the board. And while there are a few places that don't get used all that often, the necessity to use them does definitely come up from time to time. My only real issue with Rise to Nobility is the in-game scoring. I love me a big old point salad. And while Rise to Nobility plays like a game that would have a point salad at the end, it definitely doesn't have one. Basically, you have your victory points and your nobility track, which gives you a little bit of victory points, and any resources that you have left on the board, which give you a fairly small amount of victory points. And I haven't found either the nobility track or especially the resources to actually shake up the in-game scoring in any way. Usually whoever has the highest score is the one who wins. And while it is possible to focus heavily on the victory points and not on the nobility, the problem there is that if you don't raise your nobility, then you won't be able to get some of the Stone Council tiles, which means that you're getting fewer victory points at the end of the game. As I said before, I really love this game. I usually play with 2 players, but I have played with other player counts, including the solo, which, much like Cavern Tavern, I still have yet to beat. But this is definitely probably my favorite Euro right now. My wife and I both really enjoy the game. We've played the game many, many times and still find it coming back to our table quite often. Anyway, I hope you'll check out this game, Rise to Nobility. It's a great game, plays 1 to 6 players, about 25 minutes per player. And feel free to comment below and let me know what you thought of this video and if you agree or massively disagree with my opinion. And I'll see you next time. Until then, Rukus rest.